feel the burn. Oh my gosh, hi, how are you? Sorry, didn't see you there. I was in the zone. Guess I can switch back to this now. Anyways, how's it going? Welcome back to another Cold Blood and Cocktails. As you beautiful people know, any teeth you may have, please cast it away because this is a channel of positive energy, okay? Thank you. Oh, my little poppin' pectorals, how you doing today? I hope wherever you're at in the world, you're having a spiffy day so far. I myself am doing very, very good. I'm kind of excited because this is a little bit of a hot topic. Today's story was actually suggested by one of y'all. Thank you very much. And then I saw either 2020 or Dateline or somebody is doing like a 4-part series on this right now. I haven't watched that, but if you want probably way more details than what I'm about to give, definitely check it out. But this will be like the Cliff Notes version. Also, how do we feel about today's outfit? I mean, obviously, it's very natural. I've never exposed my bare chest like this. Who am I becoming? But I mean, I've really been working out. My skin's a little bit saggy. That's what the sun does. Oh, I could crush a watermelon between my boobies. Oh, and does he have abs? He sure does. Look at that washboard cheese grater. Yes. Okay, anyways, let's go on with the story. This bow tie's just got a life of its own. He's moving everywhere today. At the end of this video, it's gonna be around my knees. But yes, today's episode is on Chippendales. Hold on, I have to move my fan up. I am already sweating. It is very warm to look this hot. Whew. I don't think there's anyone out there that hasn't heard of Chippendales, like unless you've lived under a rock. But oh, I can remember myself as a younger man just staring at those chiseled hot bods and thinking, yeah, I'm gay. We all know of Chippendales as the cuffed and collared boys with rock-hard bodies. I always think of that old Chris Farley SNL skit, but tonight, sweaty, nearly naked tan bodies isn't all that we're going to be talking about. No, my loves. Tonight we're going to be talking about the rather gruesome history that Chippendales has, a history that includes murder, gay gas. But before we get too far ahead of ourselves, let's announce our drink so that y'all can drink along with me. I asked online which cocktail I should feature today, and a majority of people said the tuxedo, which I absolutely agree with. However, I don't have gin or absinthe, and that makes up 2 of like the 3 ingredients. So because this is kind of a bloody tale, I thought we'd come out with a red drink. Oh, shocking. Florals for spring, groundbreaking. But no, this is just strawberry fizzy water, some strawberry schnapps, and a bit of champagne. It is toasty. No, it is tasty. I'm toasty. It's very warm in here. Slap on a little bit more of that glissy gloss and let's dive the fuck in. So, in 1979, Chippendales first hit the scene way out in Los Angeles, breaking into the chastity belts and hearts of women all over. This group of men that danced were strippers, but they weren't the kind of strippers that would get totally naked. Like, they didn't strip down and do like a helicopter with their snake. But all cheers to that one. Whew. No, these men knew how to tease the audience without actually showing everything. Not only that, but they combined their scantily clad costumes with dance moves that put the cream in scream. Oh, literally. There really wasn't anything like this out there for women to enjoy, which made its popularity rise like a tent. It had mostly been females who were doing burlesque shows and dancing at titty bars that everyone's dad definitely didn't go to after work. Now there was a whole new genre of men trying to please women, about damn time too. When it took off, these dancers turned into like global sensations. Suddenly they weren't just dancers, they were celebrities, they were stars. They'd be on talk shows around the world. They were basically the Beatles if the Beatles couldn't sing and had abs on top of their abs and asses like buttered dinner rolls. The world was these men's oysters, and I bet you they were making some pearls appear. Money was coming in, thousands of dollars were turning into millions of dollars. All is good, right? Well, wrong. If all were good, we wouldn't be sitting here right now, would we, honey? Gosh, we're just barely in and daddy is glugging up. Woohoo! So now the 80s come around. Ask anyone who lived in the 80s. They will tell you it was a wild time. I'm talking big hair, lots of booze, sex, and rock and roll. And if you ask a woman, they'll probably also mention it was the heyday of Chippendales. I mean, this was a safe place for females to come and not get gawked at. They were treated like royalty because they were the ones keeping the men in business. And what woman wouldn't fucking love it? These muscle men would come out in tight shirts, dance a foot away from them, tear their shirts off like fucking Tarzan, and wave around the firmest ass cheeks you've ever seen. Have I mentioned they were like buttered rolls? Single and married women alike were sucking the show up like there was no tomorrow. Like men would pick up an audience member, carry them around, dance for them, and all the ladies would just swoon, and then the men would slowly unzip their teeny tiny little shorts, reveal a little side action, and the crowd would just roar. And you know every lady in there just wanted a damn wardrobe malfunction, but that was their shtick. quick, you get a preview, your imagination does the rest. And it drove the crowd knuckin' futz, man. It made women feel like they were just watching a show, but still doing something naughty, and that was just thrilling. It wasn't cheating, it was just looking, and honestly, there wasn't any more nudity than what you'd find at a hotel pool in South Beach. And with feminism on the uprise, women thought, you know what, bloody hell, if men have been able to watch women dance on stage naked for hundreds of years, they should have a chance for a good time too. Women were making their own money, they could spend it however the hell they wanted, and if that was throwing it at some oiled up man in pleather pants with a mullet and a sock stuffed in their crotch, then they were going to. But to understand how all of this incredible success came to be, we have to understand the original owner, Steve Banerjee. People would interview him saying, don't you think this might just be a fad? And he'd say, lust is not a fad. It'll always exist, which makes what we do kind of a necessity. And in a way, the Chippendales success story is kind of like the all-American dream. Steve grew up very, very poor, moved all the way from India to LA. He didn't have the money to start his own company, so he began working as a janitor, but always dreaming of something bigger and better. Don't we all? Cheers to that. Honestly, kudos to anyone who can go to a new country and become successful. That has to be one of the most admirable things I think ever. But Steve, I mean, he was a go-getter. He eventually acquired the money to start his own business, and I think he opened up a few gas stations. Steve knew literally nothing about cars, and he had never actually had dirt on his hands, but he just dreamed of having that house in the Hollywood Hills like Hugh Hefner, and he wanted to create an all-American brand that would get him this lifestyle. Also, Hugh Hefner seems to appear quite frequently in this series. He was literally in our last story too, and he's gonna be in this one, so like, he got around. Anyways, the gas stations are good, but his next investment is a nightclub, which he called Destiny 2, even though there was no Destiny 1 or a Destiny 3. This was before Chippendales was born, so like in the height of the 70s and disco. But even with club going and disco dancing being soups popular, it took a long time for his club to actually take off. And Steve was doing everything he could think of to try to make his club different. He'd have magic acts, he'd have disco lessons, game nights, exotic male dancing, female mud wrestling, but nothing really stuck. So Steve and his partner meet up and think, we need to start fresh with a rebranding. The club was already full of knockoff furniture from the designer Thomas Chippendale, and Steve was like, well, that shit sounds classy. Why don't we rename our club to Chippendales? Cheers to a smart decision. The new sign goes up, but the front door still ain't swinging. That is until a well-to-do entrepreneur named Paul Snider walks his mint green suited ass right the fuck in. And this guy was known for being a little bit greasy, like he'd kind of want to take a shower in battery acid after he spent time with him. But he was trying to make it as a club promoter and told Steve that he'd seen a gay club make it huge with nearly naked dancing men. Why doesn't Steve try something similar, but for women? And Paul was like, okay, Steve, I'll be the MC, you just house everything at your club and pay for everything. And their team was actually kind of really fucking skeptical. A lot of people were like, this shit won't last a night. But Paul and Steve, with money signs in their eyeballs, thought, oh yeah, this is the ticket. So they'd go to the gyms and the beaches on the hunt for guys to feature in their show. What an awful job that must have been. If only they had needed some volunteer help looking for these models. I guess it would have helped if I were born though. Anyways, they eventually get their cast together, and so it began, a club exclusively for women, for the most part, where the only men involved were the waiters, the bartenders, and of course, the dancers. The men were wearing G-strings and swinging their covered junk in women's faces, and it was like the fucking second coming of Elvis. Another giggity. The opening night was a huge success. Even the papers and media were talking about it. And so this started off as just a tester night to see how things would roll, but the owners soon realized that this idea could change the entire world with how people viewed sexuality with men and women. After all, Playboy bunnies had been around for men, why couldn't women have their own version? And this shit just took off and spread like herpes at band camp. And this was liberating. The men were loving being a sexual fantasy for these women. The ladies were loving the view, the money was flowing in, it was just a win-win all around. Well, Paul Snider, the guy who was in on this with Steve, just happened to be dating a Playboy playmate named Dorothy, which made Chippendales go on a Mr. Hugh Hefner's radar. Oh. Suddenly, Chippendales men were wearing cuffs and collars like the Playboy bunnies, and the workers at this club could now often be spotted hanging with Hugh at the Playboy mansion. And honey, this connection was pivotal for the success of the club. It hugely influenced it. But Paul, he was kind of a terrible MC. He was like a doctor with no bedside manners, just terrible and cringy to watch. He didn't have any interaction with the crowd. His jokes always flopped. He was just just bringing the whole vibe down. So rather than giving him a different job, Steve just kicked his ass out. The guy who brought the very idea that made this company so successful and connected them to Playboy, Steve was like, bitch, you gotta go. No thank you, no farewell lap dance, just a hearty wave and a giant fuck you. A total dick-ass move that would actually kind of become very common with Steve and his business. As you can imagine, this probably pissed Paul the fuck off because this wasn't just business, this was personal. And it didn't help that his hot girlfriend Dorothy was now rising in the ranks at Playboy and was nominated Playboy of the Year, which sadly then led to her breaking up with him because she fell for a movie director. That is literally all of Hollywood in 2 sentences right there. Paul's life was just crumbling around him and he just spiraled into a jealous and angry rage. Paul finds a 12-gauge shotgun, hunts down Dorothy, and shoots her point blank in the face. And if you haven't heard this story before, he then turns the shotgun on himself. And Paul wasn't with Chippendale any longer at this point, but this was just the first of many dark instances associated with this company and kind of directly associated with Steve. But in retrospect, at this time, there was already so much shit that was brewing. Now, this murder and suicide didn't really seem to have any effect on Steve, though. He was always behind the scenes, never front and center. And he was decent at marketing, but was an accounting extraordinaire. His brain was always ticking to think of ways to make Chippendales more money and to be more successful, but in the cheapest fucking way possible. Like, one tactic was to completely ignore the club's fire safety code. Even though the club's max was like 200, he would pack 600 ladies in there every night because he was so freaking money hungry. And then what would he do? He'd call the cops anonymously on himself, saying the strip club was overpacked. The cops would then go out there, they'd report about it, it'd be on the news, and boom, suddenly he would have an unimaginable amount of publicity for the price of what? A small fine? It's kind of smart, kind of stupid, which is basically Steve in a nutshell. But really the only thing that people knew about Steve's personal life was that he wasn't that much of a looker. He was absolutely awkward. And I guess he was dating some mystery woman who was rarely ever seen, but he'd eventually marry. He just bled Chippendales, and money was what kept his heart pumping. So when success finally came, what do you think he wanted to do? Get even bigger, which for Chippendales just meant expansion and evolution. In comes a fabulous dude named Nick, who too wanted to take Chippendales global. Nick was a theater star who claimed to be the mogul that Chippendales needed. He knew that stripping would only go so far. This needed to be a production worthy of Broadway. He knew that men, they're pretty easily satisfied. They see a girl take her top off and they go insane. They're good for the night. Women, though, they need a little bit more. They need a story. They need romance, a more sophisticated and immersive experience. So Nick introduced strip characters like Zorro, a matador, a rock star, all these personalities to fulfill the fantasies these women had. And Nick really cracked the whip and got this place into shape, like literally. The men were expected to eat a certain way. They had to stay in peak shape, you know, be in the utmost perfect physical condition. And if you arrived to work with a little bit of flub or a back flab, you'd hear about it from Nick. Because this now wasn't just a strip show, it was a production that they needed to maintain an image for. Consistency is key. And on the stage and in the books, everything was marvelous. Steve was raking in over $8 million a year because of Nick. The numbers were up, attendance was abundant, but behind the scenes, Nick and Steve were at each other's throats. Workers described this as being one of the most toxic environments ever. Like, if two people were ever meant to not work together, it was these two. Here's Nick, who's handsome, charismatic, charming, and Steve is kind of the exact opposite in every way possible, and they were just butting heads. And now Nick is talking about opening up a New York City Chippendale club that'll be bigger than Steven's original LA club, which was kind of perfect because New Yorkers were already theater ready, and a big production style strip show would be welcome with open arms, open wallets, and open legs. Steve was definitely helpful when it came to ideas on expanding this company, but he wanted to give input on production and like the choreo and dancing and stuff that he really shouldn't have been giving input on. It's just like giving Meryl Streep tips on acting. Like, you don't do that. They just saw things differently. Nick was like, what is gonna make this production the best show ever so that we can continue our success? And Steve was like, which pretty-faced man is going to sell the most tickets, even if he has 2 left feet and can't walk and chew gum at the same time? The fights between these two would just get hostile and vulgar. It was like 2 fucking maniacs. But the New York City grand opening still goes through. Nick described it as an equal opportunity fantasy factory. I like that slogan. Cheers to that. And that's me just finding any excuse to drink. But this venue was fucking enormous. It was like a sports arena with a stage jam-packed full of women throwing their dollar bills. And just like Nick thought it would be, this was an instant success. A bunch of naked men dancing. Who wouldn't think that'd be successful? Both the New York and LA locations were frequenting celebrities like John Travolta. No surprise there. There was Andy Warhol. I think Brooke Shields even had a birthday party there. And the dancers were always on daytime talk shows, from Regis and Kathy Lee to Donahue. to. And this was perfect because who was a majority of the people that watched these daytime shows? Women. And what did these women want to see? Naked men dancing with mullets, bow ties, and cuffs. These dancers were becoming household names, but so too was the man behind all of this success. And it wasn't Steve that the media wanted to talk about. No, madam, Nick was the one that was being credited as the founder of Chippendales, which rightly so enrages Steve. Like, Nick is soaking all this up and taking the credit as being the owner of this company. Steve, who had come from literally nothing to build something, was saying, who the fuck does Nick think he is? To Steve, this was like raising a successful child and some stranger taking all the credit. Like, according to Steve, Nick should have been honored to work for him. Like, here's this great-looking, well-spoken gent now becoming the face of his brand, which left Steve in the background to collect dust. Which I kind of get Steve's anger with that, but also, to be a leader, you gotta be a follower. Plus, looking back, all of the success that Chippendales ever had was because of other people's ideas. Oh no, my bow tie. Alright, it's choking me, but that's how I like it. But really, how much credit could Steve actually take? You know those scenes in movies where the boss can't think of a good idea and then the assistant says a great suggestion and the boss repeats it as if they came up with it? I always thought those scenes in movies were just so not believable, but I could totally see Steve doing something like that. He's just super jealous and angry with Nick, so he decides they need to restructure this business. Nick, who had been all about the vision and the quality of the company's production, was polar opposites with Steve. Like, if Steve could pinch a penny into two somehow, he absolutely would. He cut corners, he cheated. If there was a way to greedily hoard his money even more, he would take great measures to do so. Any opportunity to cheat a dancer out of money, Steve would find the way. In fact, some of his co-workers said his philosophy was, if I can get away with screwing people over, why not do it? Great morals. Cheers to you, bud. Yeah. The two men decided they needed to meet for a dinner and just talk business. Nick wanted acknowledgement for all of the success that he brought the company, which made it so Steve could just sit back and swim in all the money like a hog in hot shit. I think Steve went to this meeting hoping that Nick would back down, but instead Nick said, why don't we tour? We could take this shit on the road and make even more and expand our fan base. Steve was like, not what I expected, but okay. So Nick writes out a napkin deal, which was actually on a cocktail napkin, which states that he alone would have creative charge of this and any other tours that they may have, and they'll split the profits 50-50 right down the center. And Nick also included that this napkin contract was infinite, forever binding, which I think was worded in a way that Steve didn't fully understand, which is a little bit slimy. But even so, they agree on the terms. After all, Steve really doesn't think the tour will ever be anything, but maybe this will get Nick out of his hair for a little while. So he signs on the dotted line and hands the tour over, but little did Steve know that that deal would change the entire history of Chippendales. The tour starts, and this was success like nobody thought they would ever see. Think the Taylor Swift tour, but with strippers. And the dancers would work hard. They would do like 2 or 3 2-hour shows a day, maybe get a day a week off, but more often than not, they'd work straight through months at a time. And nobody minded because they were making a fucking killing while they were touring, and they were actually touring kind of strategically. Like during the hunting season, they traveled to the Midwest because while all the men were in their deer blinds, the wives would come to the shows. And venues were begging Chippendales to come dance at their club. Because if Chippendales danced one night at your venue, the club could basically pay off their rent for an entire year just in drinks from that night. Like, these dancers weren't just sought after, they were hunted down and booked the fuck up. Which I'm sure really pissed Steve off even more because even though he was getting his 50% of the profits, this was his club's name, damn it. He should be getting more, like 90-10 was fair in his mind. Even though he had no part of this tour and it was all just free money. Nick is just working his ass off to the bone, laughing his way to the bank, depositing his checks while Steve is sulking back in his LA office. Steve remembers though he has full creative rights to the Chippendale calendars, which sell like bottles of water in a desert. I will say, these are amazing, tastefully gorgeous photos of greased up buff men, and these photos would hang in women's kitchens all around the world. They actually were really fucking good, and Steve had a knack for making these pictures look amazing. Like, you gotta hand it to him for that one. He was passionate about it. I honestly think he would have been better suited as like a creative director at Chippendales rather than the owner. I think the story would probably be much different in a more positive way. But the calendars, he was selling millions of these bitches. And what's smarter, to promote this calendar, he'd have each month's man go and do talk shows. So Mr. January would be on Oprah, Mr. May would be on Kathy Lee, Lee. It was just super smart. Like, if there were any kind of accolades that Steve did deserve, it was the calendar, and he had a lot to live up to. Like, his dad owned a printing press back in India, and he wanted to emulate his father's success. And since he had so little to do with the rest of the success for the company, I think this kind of made him feel like he was somebody. But much like his father, Steven paid his workers literally next to nothing. These men in the photos were getting less than what they'd get in tips dancing for their time, yet Steve would make bank on these calendars. I just don't get how people can be like that. Like, money is never more important than ethics. But that's just not how Steve thought. Hold on, my bangs are getting fucked up. Yeah, Steve just did not give a rat's ass, and he was getting kind of sloppy too. Like in 1986, when Steve is working on the 1987 calendar, and Steve has a deadline to meet, so he heads to the place that's working on the sample. They don't have it ready for Steve until the very last moment. Steve was the final editor for the magazine, so he does a quick checkup on it, gave the sample the okay, and sent it right to the printing press. They print 800,000 copies that arrive to the warehouse, where a young man peeks at the calendar. I mean, why wouldn't he? Wouldn't you? But he opens it and is like, I should probably bring this to Steve, which he does. He holds the calendar in front of him with February open, and Steve's like, looks all right to me. Then the kid says, there aren't 31 days in February. Steve was like, really? Oh, holy shit, you're right. Oh gosh, yeah, I knew that. So everyone kind of thought it was funny, but when they realized how expensive that mistake was and how embarrassing it is to make a huge printing error being the son of a printer, the laughter was kind of short-lived. Steven was now responsible for paying for the 800,000 useless calendars, a setback of a mere 700 grand, and remember, this is the 80s, so that's like almost like 2 million today, me acting like I'm counting that out. And shit like this would happen to him, and there would be all this anger and embarrassment festering inside of him. For someone who's a known cheap-ass penny pincher, he was out a lot of dough. So who does he take his anger out on? Poor Nick, of course. Because Steven thinks he got ripped off for that napkin deal, even though the little bitch is literally making 50% for doing nothing. Like, Nick had nothing to do with Steven's mistake, yet the dude was like Steven's fucking punching bag. That is just sad. Nick was like, screw this, and if this is how you treat your employees and the person who helped your company gain success, I'll make my own dance team and blow Chippendales out of the water. Didn't sit too well with Steve, of course, probably because he knew Nick would actually outdo him. But don't forget, Nick still owned 50% of the Chippendales tour, so even though he'd be competing, he'd still earn from them. Like, Nick was truly the smart one in this business relationship, and to top it off, he had an excellent idea for his own calendar. One that would have a film over the dancer who'd be completely dressed, and then you'd lift that film to reveal the exact same picture, but with the dancer in a G-string. It was super smart, it was innovative, it was fresh, and whoo, damn, just that thought, just no. But this was a great idea, and it was honestly everything that Chippendales wasn't. So Nick rents his own office in Times Square to start his show. At this point in the 80s, Times Square is pretty much just like peep shows and shootings, kind of nasty. Not quite what it is today. But the conflict between Nick and Steven carried over into his new office. Nick would be screaming on the phone with Steve, and the whole office could tell that a gasket was about to blow in this relationship. Well, one day there was an office meeting at Nick's, and two of the employees were preparing for it. A random ass dude just walks into the office and says, hey, are you Nick? The employee's like, no, Nick is in the back. So this random ass guy walks back into the hallway, and the employees begin working again. And then just total fucking pandemonium. The next thing anyone knew, there was a gunshot, and one employee runs into Nick's office to find him slouched back in his chair. He had been shot in the head. The workers immediately call the police, but even on the phone, they can tell that Nick was gone. This really shook the shit out of people. Like, not just because this was Nick, the guy literally everyone had a crush on, but this was the tycoon behind the success of this huge company that employed so many people. And now we had this new endeavor, like, who would want to kill him? It was also very obvious to the police that Nick must have known the killer somehow. There was no sign of a struggle. Somebody had to just walk up 15 flights of stairs, enter the small office, go into the small back room, and boom, he's out. Like, this was personal. Could it have been a lover's quarrel? Like, surely this couldn't simply be because of business decisions. That would be stupid, because nobody ever gets taken out for business deals. But this was just extra shitty because at this point in New York, the crime rate was severely high. Like, if police didn't solve a crime within 48 to 72 hours, it was basically tossed out. Like, the police literally did not have more time than that to even solve a crime because they'd have to move on to the next crime while it was still hot. Well, zip up your girdles because this is just the start of something very, very dark. As it turns out, I guess not everyone loved Nick as much as people thought they did. The police were questioning some of the employees, asking who would want to kill Nick, and some of them mumbled humbled. Who the fuck wouldn't want to kill Nick? I guess Nick was a bit of a tough cookie to work with as a boss. During a public interview, even Nick himself said that if you're on his right side, he'll be as sweet as a sugar cube, but if you cross him, he'll break your fucking neck. And I think a lot of dancers had probably experienced the latter side of him. Police were investigating everyone around Nick, just trying to find leads. They interviewed his lovers with no luck. Then they went to the mob, who at this time were kind of high and mighty. They basically owned a huge majority of the clubs at that time, and they would give the acts what they thought they were worth, not what was fair. But why would they kill Nick, who was generating a fuck ton of money for them by having his shows at their venues? So that didn't really make sense, but everyone's like, how about you look at Steven, maybe? Maybe? Like, follow the money. Well, of course, the police can't get a hold of him, and when they do, he says, it couldn't have been me, I was at a restaurant in LA. And just like that, they literally dropped the case like nothing. Nick was just written off as a random big corporation murder. And the only person who seemed not to mind this was, you guessed it, Steve. In fact, he'd purchased Nick's shares in the company back from his family and was raking in 20 to 30K a night at the clubs. One dancer even remembers walking into Steven's office with a safe being wide open, just filled to the max with bricks of hundreds. My goodness, why can't a safe like that just happen to arrive on my doorstep? Oh, here you go, special delivery, and surprise, Chippendale dancer inside. Honestly though, with Nick mysteriously out of the way, Steve couldn't have been happier. He was suspiciously pleased. Cue our suspicious shot. Oh, I dare say he was almost on top of the world. However, now that Nick was gone, the Los Angeles venue was suffering. They were now stacking on overcrowding fees, and Steve had lawsuits up the ass he'd been facing even before Nick's death. One thing he was being sued for was the fact that he wouldn't allow black individuals into the club, which is very odd. I know this was a different time, but what the fuck? Like, after the female show, Steve would allow men into the club to make a little bit more money, but he would make the black men stand to the side and tell the bouncer to only let a few in. Steve thought that if there were too many black men in the club, a white woman might see and not want to go in, which is clearly discrimination. Fuck. But of course, Steve didn't care, so a young man named Don decided to take matters into his own hands. Now, Don was a black law student who had witnessed this discrimination and decided he should do a sting on this club. Yes. His two good friends were white and dressed a little bit more casually than Don for this outing. Don approached the big muscular bouncer at Chippendales, who told him that his California ID wasn't good enough to get in, he'd need a membership. Well, just then, Don's two white friends walk up behind him and get in with no questions asked. They get their hand stamps and just walk right through that door. And then they walk the fuck right out and they were pissed. They go up to the doorman, point at Don and say, he didn't get in because you're a racist piece of shit. And the doorman is like, I didn't let him in because he doesn't have a membership. And then they hold out their stamped hands and say, neither do we, and you let us right in, you dumb fuck. The doorman just stands there and looks shocked, like he doesn't know what to say, and so the three men leave and say, you'll be hearing from our lawyers. Cheers to you guys. They filed a complaint and suddenly there were court hearings against the racism that Steve was pushing. And while at one of the hearings, Don even walks up to Steve, whose skin is just as dark as his, and says, my grandfather is from Bombay. He looks just like you. And then he walks away. You go, Don. But Chippendale says, we do not discriminate. That's all they kept saying, which is obviously a lie and really isn't a cute look. And while all these trials are going on, Steve's only solution is to take out the enemy. That's always his solution, rather than looking at what he actually did wrong. It wasn't, how can I fix this for you? It's, how can I erase you? I don't know, it's kind of giving me baby dick vibes, but you do you, boo. Fortunately though, Don found out before it was too late. Apparently there was a notebook with Don's name written on the front left in a rental car. The car place calls Don and it turns out to be a log of everything Don had been doing. He left a certain store at 4 p.m. on foot, headed to the liquor store at 4:12, bought some condoms and a pack of ciggies, left at 4:20, headed back to his apartment, and so on. I guess this notebook had accidentally been left behind by a very sloppy private investigator hired by Chippendales. And Don couldn't believe that Chippendales, this strip club, was having him followed. This was Chippendales, not the fucking CIA. But fortunately, one employee blabbed and said that Steven had planned on hiring a sex worker to pick Don up and then plant drugs on him. Then Steve was gonna blackmail Don in order to change his story on the Chippendales case, and so it was just a whole shit show of a fiasco. And these employees knew exactly what Steve was capable of. They were like, is this Don guy gonna be dead now? Like, should we say something? So an employee calls Don up and says, I am the only black employee at Chippendales. I just want to warn you that you should probably be a little bit scared for your life. Like, Steven has said that things would definitely be easier if you were dead. So Don files a class action lawsuit and Chippendales pays 85 grand and says they'll hire more black workers. Not that they'll take ethics and race classes, they'll just hire more people. Come on, man. Like, grow with the times. We're all human. Fucking racist little bitch. But that was just the tip of this peen-shaped iceberg. Left and right, lawsuits were coming out against Steve and his original LA club, with his overpacking of women being a fire hazard with more discrimination, and with each lawsuit, Steve would turn away even farther. Little man was turning his head so damn much he was gonna look like Linda Blair in The Exorcist, who's like a fucking cockatoo or a toddler and figured, if I can't see them, they can't see me. Okay. And before he knew it, his state liquor license was pulled for the LA club, and just like that, because of accumulating suits, the fire commission pulled the plug on the club entirely. This was definitely a blow for Steve, but he didn't let this set him back. Like, life goes on, there's more money to make, more people to discriminate against, he still has his New York venue, and his mind was still set on global domination. At this point, it was 1991, and there was a lot of knockoff versions of his show touring the US, so a friend of Steven's had an idea that maybe they should take Chippendales abroad, like go to Europe maybe. And with this European show, it wouldn't really be like a nightclub kind of vibe, but a true stage show with theatrics. Kind of like what Nick had been planning. So they created a musical with muscle, and in 3 weeks, they were sold out. This was a huge production with American guys making European women swoon with their accents and oily bodies. It was so popular, in fact, that the stage manager called Steve and said, we need a second tour to go on the road. And suddenly, the business was back to booming and raking in ridiculous amounts of money. The Belgians called, the Germans called, the French called, literally every European country wanted a version of this show. Suddenly, there was 120 Chippendales dancers touring all over Europe, selling out venues left and right. This once again led to knockoff shows being produced, but this time in Europe, and Steve's blood pressure was rising. How dare anyone take the idea like this and run with it too? However, now the knockoff shows were produced by ex-Chippendale dancers who knew the secrets to success. One of these groups, Adonis, which was run by ex-Chippendale dancer Reed Scott, was booked for the Blackpool show in Europe, and just as the show starts, Reed was on stage talking to the crowd when suddenly the producer calls him over and says, get off stage, I need you and all the other cast members, like, over there right the fuck now. Well, apparently a detective had intercepted a call about a contract that was put out on Reed, where I guess he was to be injected with a syringe full of cyanide. Reed was just flabbergasted, and just as a side note, every freaking time we do a story with a hitman, I just can't even fathom how frightening that must be for the victim, just to know that somebody went through great lengths to have you erased. But back to the story, I think everyone and their mother knew who these threats were coming from. There's only one person that was pissed about other people's success, and that was Steve. Poor Reed was in Europe now, sleeping with a knife under his pillows, putting bookshelves in front of his doors at night, just fearing for his life. Was this hitman gonna go after his son, after his family? All he kept saying was, this has to be Steve. It is just too much of a quinky dink that people around Steve die when Steve doesn't get his way. Time goes on, the case continues to be investigated, and then in Vegas, police receive a random ass phone call from some guy named Strawberry. Now, if that's not a stripper name, I don't know what the hell is. Well, Strawberry was hired to inject Reed with cyanide, but who hired Strawberry? The FBI found out it was some charming muscle mob guy named Ray Cologne. I wonder if he smelled good. Well, who the fuck is Ray? Get this, in 1978, Ray meets Steve, and it becomes an instant connection, not like a sexual connection. They were just good friends. Whenever Steve needs anything done, Ray is the man to do the job, whether it be setting up new sound equipment or setting a rivalry club on fire. Oh, what? Yes, I said that. We'll flash forward to the 90s, and these two are still good friends. Police end up raiding Ray's house to find a bag with a skull and crossbones drawn on it like a fucking movie. How cliche could one be? But inside this bag, what do you think there is? Enough cyanide to kill almost 250 people. First of all, who the fuck needs that much cyanide? Like, greedy much? Obviously, they immediately arrest Ray, and after sitting in jail for 7 months, he finally breaks down and says he'll tell the cops whatever they want to hear. And holy glittery tits did Mary talk. He starts by saying that, yes, it was him who was hired to inject Reed with cyanide, but then he also goes into the details of Nick's murder and connects them together with who? None other than Steve Banerjee. Wow, shocker. Steve apparently is the head shit. He's the one who hired the hitman to kill Nick, who hired Ray to kill Reed. Steve approached Ray and was like, this dude Nick is taking millions from me. I have nowhere else to turn. Just kill the fucking guy. And Ray says, yes, I'll help, but I won't pull the trigger on anyone. So then Ray hires a hitman to kill Nick, a hitman who at this point was already in prison for other crimes. And then he never even got to go through with the cyanide. So police are like, let's go undercover and get Steve on tape admitting to this. Ray was supposed to be in prison for this, so they'd have to record the phone calls from prison to Steve. However, Steve was not loving the idea of talking about this shit over the phone, especially when the other person was in prison. Like, he was such a paranoid little shit as it was. So Ray tells Steve that he's temporarily getting out of prison to seek treatment for his kidney disease, which was actually true. But since he was out, they should meet and discuss a plan. So they meet in Santa Monica. Fucking love Santa Monica. Ray is all wired up and he is ready to talk about their past, all the arson, the murders, the scandals, the good old times. They get to the restaurant and immediately Steve puts his finger to his mouth to shush Ray and points towards the bathroom. I've done that too. Well, probably not for the same reason though. They head in there, the stalls are all empty, and so Steve starts writing on sticky notes, showing them to Ray and then tearing them up and flushing them. Ray keeps saying, "What the fuck are you doing? Can we just talk about this?" But Steve won't say a word and the mic Ray is wearing doesn't pick up anything. Somehow Steve knew what the fuck was up. He was just a scared little rat. He knew his days of freedom were numbered. Imagine being that slimy of a person where you fear for your life and can't even talk. Like, what the fuck is the point of even living anymore? That's not life. But he was kind of smart sometimes. Like, the police would have a move and Steve would be one move ahead of them. But Ray knows how Steve's mind works. To take down a criminal, one must think like a criminal. So Ray says to the police, oh god, there was hair in that. Ugh. So Ray says to the police, what if I tell Steve that I'm a fugitive and run to Europe? Like, if I tell Steve to meet me in Europe as a fugitive and say I bounced out of prison, why would he suspect that I'm wired? Plus, free trip to Europe, limoncello, anyone? Yes! The police are like, that's actually not a bad idea, so that's what they did. And they went like hardcore Hollywood movie with this shit. The FBI obtained a fake passport for Ray, something they rarely ever did. Like, this was unheard of for the FBI, not only to take a criminal out of the country, but then to give him a disguise consisting of a beret and a mustache. This actually was like a very low budget movie, but it was also kind of a cute look, very trendy for the time. They end up meeting in Zurich and Steve compliments Ray and says, it really looks like you've been on the run a while. I feel like the show Undercover Boss needs their stylists. But Ray's like, thanks, I got all new duds. Let's take this to the hotel room so we can be completely private. Steve's like, yeah, that's cool, that's fine, that's not suspicious at all. So they go, and just like every murder mystery movie, the FBI is listening in on them from the room next door. And this was kind of a do or die plan too. There really wasn't a plan B to this. This was the plan B. So Ray starts talking about random shit, totally avoiding the murders. He was hoping that Steve might just organically start venting, which of course he did. He likes Ray's idea of being on the run, and he himself had considered fleeing back to India. After all, there's nothing more important than money and freedom, and he had the money, but he knew his freedom wouldn't last much longer. They're both drinking pretty heavily there in the room. Steve because he's depressed, Ray was just drinking because he was so fucking nervous. And then Steve starts telling Ray to be quiet because these walls are thin and the FBI might be on the other side listening. Ray was secretly shitting himself, but he gets up and says, you are so full of it. He pounds on the walls just to show that they're pretty thick. Poor person on the other side with a microphone is probably deaf on that side now. But actually, huge LOL because the FBI was listening. Steve was just getting really paranoid, man. Like, he wanted to know if Ray had heard anything from the FBI about the deed being Nick's murder. And the FBI was just like peeing themselves with excitement, but they were like, we need more. But of course, Steve sealed the deal on his own ass and said, do they know I gave you the money to buy the guns? Come the fuck on. What? Of course, he didn't know the FBI was listening, so okay. And that right there is the moment the FBI put baby stew in their dainties. They had exactly what they needed. Hearing Steve admit to participation, anything further that he said would just be the cream on top. So they give it a couple more minutes and suddenly, bang, in storms in the FBI. Steven is sitting on the edge of the bed like a wet poodle getting its anal glands extracted, completely shocked and horrified at what he had just admitted, which he knew the FBI had heard. So they send Steve's ass to jail where he awaited sitting the possibility of life in prison and a $1.75 million fine. Oh, God, even today that would be rough, but this was like 30 years ago. And it seems as though justice is finally about to be served. He ends up being charged on 8 counts and is held on suspicion of fleeing the country. And everyone who knows him is thinking, this whole jail lifestyle, it's probably not gonna work for Steve. Like, he has cucumbers put on his eyes by 7:30 a.m., a foot massage by 9. I don't even know if they have cucumbers in prison. Well, probably not the edible kind. But Steve was becoming increasingly depressed behind bars. There really wasn't any good outcome here, and he knew it. His lifestyle of feeling he was owed the world just for riding on people's other ideas had finally caught up with him, and there's nothing more humbling than paying for your wrongdoings. So a little time passes, now we're in 1994, and Steve's lawyers send in a plea deal which was accepted by the court. He had agreed to plead guilty to the biggest charge, which would give him 25 years in prison, and he would give up his shares for the calendar. The friends of the victims were like, a fucking plea deal? Are you serious? Well, the day of the hearing arrives, and the victims' friends are waiting waiting in the courthouse for hours. Nothing has happened, and then someone steps out of the chambers and says the hearing's been canceled for that day. The courtroom immediately is pissed and they're shouting. Like, how long would they have to wait for justice to finally be served? Everyone was like, what the hell? Steve was supposed to be convicted of hiring someone to kill Nick for plotting 3 former Chippendales dancers for arson and for racketeering. Like, that's a pretty hefty fucking list. Well, all the people had been in the courthouse all day. When they went home, they discovered that Steve had been found hanging in his jail cell that morning before the trial. This was a total shock to everyone, but also not really, because like, if you knew Steve, you know that he'll take the easy way out of literally everything rather than facing up to his own consequences. And people were really angry. Like, this coward of a man chose when the people he murdered died and he got to choose his own fate. Steve cheated the system in the biggest ways possible. He screwed his employees out of earnings by giving them less than they deserved. He cheated the justice system by murdering multiple people who had a lot to offer the world and getting away with it for years, and then finally cheated the victim's family and friends out of a justified sentencing by killing himself. And just to screw everyone out of the possibility of getting financial restitution, the act of Steve killing himself made it so that his Chippendale shares went to his own family versus the government to spread to the victims' families. Victor, the guy who actually murdered Nick for hire, got 25 to life in prison. Ray got a reduced sentence of 2 years for his cooperation. And now, decades later, Chippendales is obviously under new ownership and it is thriving. I've never been there, but I've heard their Vegas show is really, really good. Like, really good. I almost said to die for, but that's too soon and very déclassé. But yeah, I don't really know how to feel about this. I'm sad for the victims. I certainly wish there was justice. How do you feel about this? Do you think Steve's outcome was justified and fair? Do you think the family should have gotten Steve's calendar shares? Like, does that even matter? It's just interesting because everyone knows about Chippendales, but I feel like few people know the darkness behind the brand. Kind of reminds me of Gucci, where it's a household name, but there's so much hidden behind the name. And just like the Gucci story, there's entitlement where there shouldn't be. There's very sloppy murders paid for by the cheapest bitches ever. It's just weird because a lot of these big corporations, and anytime there's murder within them, they're kind of similar. It's just weird. But anyways, my loves, cheers to you. Thank you so much for being on this journey with me. What else is floating in there? I think it's a mixture of my lip gloss, cat hair, and whatever's left of my hopes and dreams. But let me know down in the comments below if there are any tidbits that you want to add to this story. I know there's so much juice in this, but we'd be here for hours and hours and hours. Ain't nobody got time for that. But yes, thank you so much for being here. Truly, from the bottom of my little muscular heart, I love having you. And if you're ever bored and think, you know what, I could use a little bit more of that little bitch Nady in my life, please head over to my Patreon. It's patreon.com/Poplux. You get videos a day early, you get Patreon only content, and best part, it is cheap, fun, and fancy, just like me. And like always, please be sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell down below so that you're notified anytime I upload a new video. Don't forget my newest collection of highlighters, including Black Ice, which does change from black to white, will be available again soon at thepoplux.com. Also, my latest album, Kiss of Fame, is available everywhere online that music is sold. Thank you so much to everyone who's supporting them. Comment down below, let me know what you thought of this video. Don't forget to like and subscribe. You can follow me on Snapchat, Instagram, and Twitter at officialnady, and you can follow me online at thepoplux.com. Thank you so much for watching. I love you all, and I will see you again soon. Bye!